final Alaskan adventure, we headed to Valdez. Even though it was early September, as we drove along the Richardson Highway, it was obvious that we were in the midst of fall and winter was quickly on its way. The trees were full of beautiful fall colors and the mountains were snow-capped. The sun shone its glory onto the Worthington Glacier just as we drove past. We were lucky to drive this road after recent rain and snow because there were waterfalls cascading everywhere. Thank goodness there were pullouts next to the large waterfalls. Before we headed into Valdez, we turned off the road to check out the Salmon Gulch Hatchery. And my goodness, what an amazing decision. The sea lions were out in full force, taking advantage of the readily available and plentiful spawning salmon. This was our first introduction to the King of the Hill fights. There was an obvious alpha and a few challengers to that position. The king had quite a few battle scars, and what amazed me the most was seeing the massive nails on their back fins. Apparently they are mostly used for scratching their backs, but those things look like they can do some damage. I could stay and watch these guys for hours. They were fascinating. The seagulls were another interesting animal to watch. They would fly in and take advantage of eating the discarded remnants of salmon floating in the water. Leaving the hatchery, we arrived in Valdez and found our friend's beautiful Nordic tug in the harbor. The next morning, the weather cleared just enough for a boat ride. The first thing Mike pointed out was the Valdez oil terminal.
The big tankers come in and
Right. If you off to the right, you see the row of lights right along the water.
Yep.
That's where the tankers pull up to start taking on crude oil.
that's got to be an operation.
Yeah. You see all the round tanks and the white roofs on them.
I'm assuming those are all holding tanks.
Those are all holding tanks, and the lids on those tanks float on the oil.
Oh,
And they shovel them.
Whoa.
They shovel those. Yeah.
This is where the tanker ships pull up to load the crude oil for transport to Washington and California. It was fascinating to think that just a few weeks prior, we were up in northern Alaska on the Dalton Highway, driving right beside the pipeline. The smooth waters were such a welcome change from the 4-foot chops we experienced while jet skiing out of Whittier. After we saw more amazing waterfalls, we came across an extremely large group of birds. They were just hanging out in the water, and there were thousands of them. Mike even let me take a turn at the helm.
Just dots like that. These little speckles here and there could be the clouds.
We saw quite a few bald eagles. This was the best footage I got from any of the sightings. We got back to the harbor, cooked up some dinner, and the next morning we helped Mike winterize the boat. Barb and I teak oiled every wooden surface, while the men winterized the engine and removed the dinghy. We went back to the hatchery to watch the show, and the tide was out this time. There were dead fish everywhere, and the stink of it was very present. The low tide allowed other animals to eat. The seagulls were having feasts, and a mama bear and her cubs even came down for some grub. The rain wasn't clearing, so we decided it was a good time to start heading back to the lower 48. The fall colors were so vibrant as we drove into Tok before we turned south back into the Yukon. The evenings were definitely getting cooler. We had to break out some warmer clothing. This time at the border crossing, the agent was most interested in fish and wildlife and wanted to know if we had done any fishing or hunting. We hadn't, so it was easy and we passed through quickly. This part of the highway between the Yukon border and Destruction Bay was the worst road we had been on during the entire journey. It was worse than the Top of the World Highway and the Dalton Highway. The potholes were huge. The frost heaves came out of nowhere. Slow is most definitely the way to go on this road. At some point during the day, a rock had flown over our truck cab and broken the window into our camper. It was a very awkward location to fix. We duct taped the inside and the outside of the window and continued on our way. The fix lasted until we got home. Arriving back into Whitehorse, we visited the Transportation Museum since it was closed during our first trip through the town on our way north. The front of the museum features a DC-3 wind vane. Yes, this baby pivots with the wind. There wasn't much wind on the day we were there, but we could see it moving with the slightest breeze. The inside of the museum houses exhibits showcasing many different forms of transportation throughout the Yukon. We then jumped south onto the Cassier Highway with more beautiful scenery. It is worth mentioning that this highway is very different than the others we have traveled so far. It reminded us of the back roads in Pennsylvania and Virginia. They are narrow and curvy, but fun to drive. From a camp host, we learned of a local tribal fish camp where the salmon were jumping, so we decided to check it out. The directions were simply to turn right onto the road before you cross the river, and then follow the white fish on the trees. Amazingly enough, we found it. This is a retaining pond that the fish just swim into. Talk about an easy catch. The sign said that the man-made falls ensure that 99% of the sockeye salmon use the fish ladder for their upward migration. But my question is, why do we want the fish to use a ladder instead of a natural migration path? If any of you do know the answer, I am actually very interested, so please leave it in the comments. Either way, I was just imagining how extremely tired and worn out they are from all the upstream swimming, and then to encounter these falls, and to try to jump time and time again, it must wear them out even more. All to eventually hope they find the fish ladder. We made another stop in the town of Smithers to help our friends change the brake pads on their van. We found an excellent parking lot for the work, and the weather was perfect. All went well, and we headed to our camp for the night. It seems almost everything closes in mid-September, including the campgrounds. We ended up boondocking in a campground parking lot, along with about 8 others who were doing the same. The black bears were very active at the campground. We saw 6 of them within a span of a few hours. The next morning, we split off from our friends and headed straight south, through the smoke-filled air from wildfires in the area, eventually making it back to the lower 48 and ending our Alaskan adventure. I hope you enjoyed our Alaskan road trip series. Please subscribe to follow more of our adventures.